What makes this situation stand out is that Iran did not follow a familiar or predictable pattern in its response. In past scenarios, reactions often came in forms that analysts could anticipate, either through direct retaliation, proxy activity, or delayed signaling. But this time, the approach appears different. Instead of repeating known tactics, the response suggests a shift in thinking, where unpredictability itself becomes part of the strategy. Changing strategy in the middle of a high-tension environment is not a random decision. It usually reflects a deeper reassessment of objectives, risks, and long-term positioning. By moving away from expected patterns, Iran creates uncertainty for its opponents. And in conflict situations, uncertainty can be just as powerful as direct action. When the other side cannot clearly predict the next step, it becomes harder to prepare an effective counter-strategy. This kind of shift also forces intelligence systems to adjust. Analysts rely heavily on patterns, past behavior, established doctrines, and known response timelines. When those patterns are disrupted, the entire analytical framework has to be recalibrated. What worked before in predicting actions may no longer apply, which increases the margin for error in decision-making. That alone can slow down response planning and create hesitation at critical moments. At the same time, adopting a new approach allows for greater flexibility. It opens the door to different types of responses, whether in timing, scale, or method, without being locked into a predictable cycle of action and reaction. This flexibility can be used to manage escalation carefully, applying pressure in ways that are less obvious but still effective. There is also a signaling dimension to this shift. By demonstrating that it is willing to break from past patterns, Iran communicates that it is adapting and evolving. This can influence how opponents perceive future risks, as they now have to consider a wider range of possibilities rather than relying on familiar expectations. One of the most significant aspects of this situation is the element of surprise and how it directly impacted U.S. officials. In high-level conflicts, decision-makers rely heavily on predictions, built from intelligence reports, historical patterns, and behavioral analysis. When an action breaks away from those expectations, it doesn't just catch attention, it forces an immediate reassessment. That's exactly what happened here. The move didn't fit the anticipated timeline or method, which is why it created a shock factor at the policy and intelligence level. Surprise in this context is not just about timing, it's about disrupting confidence. When analysts and officials believe they understand an opponent's likely actions, they build strategies around those assumptions. But when those assumptions fail, even temporarily, it introduces doubt into the entire decision-making process. Plans that were considered reliable suddenly need to be reviewed, and responses that seemed appropriate may no longer match the reality on the ground. This kind of unexpected development also compresses reaction time. U.S. officials are pushed into a position where they must quickly gather updated intelligence, reassess risks, and adjust their posture, all while the situation continues to evolve. That urgency increases pressure across multiple levels of leadership, from military commanders to policy advisors, as they work to interpret what the move means and what it signals for the near future. At the same time, unpredictability makes it harder to separate signal from noise. Not every action immediately reveals its full intent, especially when it breaks from established patterns. Officials must consider multiple scenarios, whether the move is a one-time shift, part of a broader strategy, or the beginning of a new phase. Each possibility requires a different type of response, which adds complexity to an already tense situation. There's also a broader strategic impact. When one side successfully introduces surprise, it can temporarily shift the advantage by forcing the other side into a reactive position. Instead of controlling the pace, the responding side must adapt to it. That shift alone can influence how quickly and confidently decisions are made, especially when the margin for error is already narrow. Another critical dimension in this situation is how Iran responded despite facing significant pressure from recent leadership losses. In most cases, when high-ranking officials are targeted or removed, it can create a temporary disruption within command structures, slowing coordination, affecting communication, and forcing internal adjustments. But what stands out here is that the response still appeared organized and deliberate. suggesting that operational capability remained intact even under pressure. This sends a strong signal about resilience. It indicates that decision-making systems are structured in a way that allows continuity, even when key individuals are no longer present. In strategic terms, that kind of resilience matters because it reduces the likelihood that external pressure alone can immediately weaken response capacity. It shows that contingency planning may already be in place, with alternative chains of command and predefined response frameworks ready to activate when needed. There is also a perception factor involved. When a country demonstrates that it can absorb a shock at the leadership level and still execute a coordinated response, it reinforces an image of stability and control. That perception can influence how opponents evaluate risk. Instead of expecting hesitation or disorganization, they now have to consider the possibility of consistent and structured reactions moving forward. At the same time, responding under these conditions can serve as a form of signaling. It communicates that pressure tactics, such as targeting leadership, may not produce the immediate strategic advantage that might have been intended. This can affect how future actions are calculated on both sides, especially when it comes to assessing the effectiveness of similar tactics. Internally, maintaining a coordinated response after leadership disruption also reflects on institutional strength. It suggests that systems, protocols, and communication networks are functioning in a way that does not rely solely on individual figures. That level of organization can help sustain operational momentum, even in moments where external observers might expect a pause or slow down. Another major shift in this situation is how the overall pattern of the conflict is beginning to change. Earlier phases of tension often followed a more recognizable rhythm: a move, a response, a period of pause, and then a controlled cycle of escalation. Analysts could study these patterns, identify trends, and build expectations around how each side might act next. But when that rhythm starts to break, the entire framework used to understand the conflict becomes less reliable. What's emerging now is a more fluid and less predictable sequence of actions. Instead of clear cause and effect responses, there are moves that don't immediately align with previous behavior. This disrupts the ability to map out likely scenarios, making it harder for policymakers and military planners to anticipate outcomes. Without a consistent pattern, even experienced analysts are forced to consider a wider range of possibilities, many of which carry higher levels of uncertainty. This shift also affects how quickly situations can escalate. In a predictable environment, there is often some level of built-in expectation that allows for measured responses. But when patterns become unclear, reactions can become more cautious or, in some cases, more aggressive, depending on how each side interprets the uncertainty. That variability increases the chances of sudden changes in intensity, where a single move can have a larger than expected impact. There's also a strategic advantage in breaking patterns. When one side introduces unpredictability, it forces the other side out of its comfort zone. Established response plans may no longer apply, and decision-makers have to operate with less confidence in their assumptions. This can slow down reaction times or lead to overcompensation, both of which can shift the balance in subtle but important ways. At the same time, this evolving pattern makes communication more difficult. Signals that might have been clear in a structured environment become harder to interpret when the sequence of actions is no longer consistent. This increases the risk that intentions are misunderstood, especially in a high-pressure setting where decisions are being made quickly and with incomplete information. One of the most concerning aspects of this situation is how quickly the overall risk level has increased. As unpredictability enters the equation, it doesn't just make the conflict harder to follow, it raises the stakes for every decision being made. In more stable scenarios, both sides can rely on patterns, communication signals, and past behavior to guide their responses. But when those reference points start to break down, the margin for error becomes significantly smaller. This rise in risk is closely tied to how decisions are made under uncertainty. When information is incomplete or rapidly changing, leaders are forced to act based on probabilities rather than clear outcomes. That environment can lead to more cautious behavior in some cases, but it can also push toward faster and more assertive responses in others. The challenge is that neither side can be fully certain how their actions will be interpreted, which adds another layer of tension to every move. At the same time, Unpredictability increases the likelihood of unintended escalation. A response that is meant to be limited or symbolic might be perceived as something much larger, triggering a stronger counteraction. Without a clear understanding of intent on both sides, even controlled actions can produce outcomes that go beyond what was originally planned. This dynamic creates a situation where escalation can happen, not because it was intended, but because it was misinterpreted. Operational pressure also plays a role in raising the risk level. Military systems are often placed on higher alert, response times are shortened, and personnel are expected to react quickly to developing situations. While these measures are designed to enhance readiness, they also reduce the time available for verification and careful analysis. In fast-moving environments, decisions made under pressure can carry long-term consequences, especially when multiple layers of response are involved. There is also a psychological dimension to increased risk. As uncertainty grows, so does the sense of urgency among decision-makers. The need to maintain credibility, demonstrate control, and avoid appearing vulnerable can influence how actions are taken. This pressure can narrow the range of perceived options, making more assertive choices seem necessary even when the broader situation remains unclear. At this point, the focus shifts heavily toward how the United States is processing and responding to the situation in real time. When an unexpected move disrupts prior expectations, the first step for officials is reassessment. This involves rapidly updating intelligence inputs, reevaluating threat levels, and comparing new developments against existing strategic models. What makes this process complex is that it has to happen while events are still unfolding, leaving very little room for delay or uncertainty. Reassessment is not limited to military considerations alone. It extends across multiple layers: diplomatic positioning, regional alliances, economic implications, and long-term strategic goals. Decision-makers have to determine whether the latest development represents a one-time shift or part of a broader change in approach. That distinction is critical because it influences whether the response should be immediate and forceful or measured and adaptive. At the same time, intelligence agencies play a central role in shaping the response. They work to gather updated information, verify what has actually happened, and identify possible next steps from the opposing side. This process often involves analyzing patterns, even when those patterns appear to be shifting. The challenge lies in separating meaningful signals from background noise, especially in a fast-moving and high-pressure environment. Military posture is also reviewed and, if necessary, adjusted. This doesn't always mean immediate action, but it can involve repositioning assets, increasing readiness levels, and ensuring that response options are available if required. These adjustments are often calibrated carefully to avoid unnecessary escalation while still maintaining a credible deterrent. Diplomatic channels, both public and private, are activated alongside these efforts. Officials communicate with allies, coordinate positions, and exchange information to build a clearer picture of the situation. At the same time, messaging becomes an important tool. What is said publicly can influence perception, reassure partners, and signal intent without direct confrontation. All of this happens under significant time pressure, where decisions must be made quickly but still carry long-term consequences. The combination of uncertainty, urgency, and high stakes creates an environment where every adjustment, whether in policy, posture, or communication, plays a role in shaping how the situation evolves in the hours and days ahead.